On this channel, I have covered one of James Burnham's other books, Suicide of the West. I found that book to be incredibly dull and wanting in genuine intellectual content. But the Managerial Revolution is quite different. In this case, Burnham actually displays a degree of insight. This book's thesis is fascinating. The forces inherent to capitalism, combined with several political forces that are pushing for the intervention of the state in the economy, are part of this managerial revolution, which will cause the transition to a managerial society. Burnham defines the managerial society as one in which the means of production come under control of the state, and in which a class of people called managers hold all the power. Managers are people who oversee the productive process rather than the people who directly own the means of production. One might see a flaw in this framing, which is that the state could constitute at once manager and owner, but Burnham argues that in the state, ownership becomes public and is thus separate from the task of managing, as profits go to the state as a whole rather than to an individual. We might ask then whether Burnham's thesis is accurate. Has there been a managerial revolution, or the beginnings thereof? Orwell replied to this book, and his synopsis is that we have not seen such a thing. He argues that Burnham was extrapolating too credulously from current happenings in the world, assuming that what is happening today will continue happening in the future, something there is really no reason to assume. Thus, what Burnham sees in the New Deal, the US trending toward a state-owned economy, did not actually end up with state ownership over business. Burnham's time frame for this revolution is actually very short. He predicted that the world's major economies would become managerial in just a couple of decades, citing the examples of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. But today we obviously have the benefit of time to check whether Burnham was right, and it appears that he was completely and entirely wrong, especially once we consider the collapse of the Soviet Union. The reality is that politics moves very slowly, despite the apparent speed of our modern world. As the Chuds say, nothing ever happens. But if we ignore the contingencies of Burnham's predictions, such as the time or the methods, we can say that it is to a certain extent correct. The global elite are envisioning a type of society that is neither capitalist nor communist, but which centralizes all ownership under the state and eliminates even personal property, as people will universally rent everything they use. It is a sort of landlord society where the state is the only landlord. Thus, some people have called it neo-feudalism. Others call it neo-capitalism. It doesn't really have a good name other than Project 2030. Its goal is to preserve a market economy into the conditions of resource scarcity, hence the term that frequently gets thrown around on this subject, sustainability. If we dispense with the specific mechanisms of action that Burnham proposes, which are supposed to lead to the managerial society, and substitute instead the problem of scarcity, then we can say that Burnham's predictions might describe our distant future. Only time will tell whether the global elite have enough power to implement their vision, or if the world handles scarcity in another way. So how does he arrive at the conclusion that the future is going to be managerial? First, we must note Burnham's argument that communism, in the Marxist sense, cannot ever come to fruition. He divides his analysis into the reform wing of Marxists, or the Social Democrats, and the radical Marxists who want to achieve communism through revolution. He notes the repeated failure of radical Marxists to achieve structural change in society, and then argues that the reformists have simply attached themselves and made themselves dependent on capitalism for their own existence. He further argues that the USSR does not resemble Marxian communism, since Leninism and Stalinism have created a society with sharp social distinctions and privileges, as well as top-down state control and a kind of nationalism, which does not match ideologically with Marxism. In short, Burnham believes that the future of the world will not and cannot be socialism. Burnham thinks that the managerial revolution will unfold more or less organically due to certain forces and tendencies within capitalism. For example, he argues that the separation of access to the means of production and the task of preferentially distributing the products of that production hands control over an enterprise to a managerial class. In fact, the broader overall point Burnham is making is that the growth of enterprises has separated functions that were previously the prerogative of the capitalist proprietor. For example, capitalists previously handled all finance and investments, but modern corporations tend to have specific people who will manage the finances of the corporation. We might think of hedge fund managers, for example. This, Burnham states, is responsible partly for the replacement of capitalists by managers. We can see then that the future for Burnham cannot be socialism, and it cannot be capitalism. It can only be the managerial society. However, I call into question whether managerial society can be brought into existence organically. No matter how separated functions become in corporations, this doesn't grant the government any degree of control over the enterprise. Burnham's conflation of both government and private persons under the title of manager serves to obscure the power relations that exist in this situation. Burnham's prophecy is that the state will gain control over all private enterprise. That's what the managerial society is. If power goes to private managers rather than to the state, then we will not have the kind of society that Burnham refers to by managerial society. There will still be private capitalists, and they will still own the corporations and enterprises. It's just that their job has been delegated to other people under the employ, or under the corporation's employ more accurately. This does not significantly change the structure of society. This is why Burnham has to place special emphasis on political revolution and the democratic process. His attempt to show that the tendencies of capitalism transfer authority to top-down managers is rather blurry and incoherent, so the only way that we can expect the managerial society to emerge is through a state takeover of the economy. It's to this end that he saw the New Deal, which he believed was the beginning of the US transition into managerialism. Given that this has now become a conversation about state power, all the previous elaboration on the tendencies of capitalism and capitalists appears to be completely pointless, other than to argue that it sets the stage for a transfer of power to managers who have already been selected by capital. The only basis that exists for managerialism, then, according to Burnham's prophecy, is that managerial society will be more efficient than capitalism by being immune to the various economic problems that a free market suffers from, such as the boom-bust cycle. Of course, this thesis is questionable because centrally planned or interventionist economies still suffer from recessions and shortages. Burnham thinks that the only problems managerial society would have are political problems like revolution and instability. But since economies are so complex and their actors so interrelated and dependent on things like natural resource availability, and also due to the fact of fluctuations of supply and demand, as well as the balance of finances, a centrally planned economy can come into crisis quite easily. It's worth noting that the transition to managerialism would have to be a crisis in itself, since a drastic change in material relationships and power relationships has to have a destabilizing effect on the economy. That is exactly what happened in the Soviet Union when the communists began their project of collectivizing production. If this is true, that centrally planned economies are not necessarily more efficient than capitalist ones, then there must be some other reason why central planning emerges. In fact, I would argue that Burnham's prophetic approach really obscures the genuine reasons why people propose and implement such economies. In the case of socialism, socialists hold that their system is superior morally as well as being inevitable. The implementation of socialism is a conscious political effort, not an organic one. The falsehood of historical materialism, such as the example of the fact that the revolution happened in economically backwards Russia, implies that the kind of managerial society represented by socialism doesn't appear due to the forces of capitalism. Thus, in a very major way, Burnham's method is wrong. Even in Germany, what Burnham, I think, mistakenly refers to as managerialism did not result from the failures of capitalism. The Weimar hyperinflation was caused by the German government borrowing over 156 billion marks by 1918 to pay for the First World War. In addition, the government purchased hard cash using paper money, which caused the value of paper money to drop considerably. In short, almost the entire phenomenon of Germany's inflation, which paved the way for Hitler's revolution, was a result of short-sighted and irresponsible government intervention into the economy. One could argue that the involvement of finance means that to some extent there is an involvement of capitalism, but it is unlikely that if left to their own devices, German companies would have borrowed as much money, and that they certainly would not have been able to produce more currency. We might also argue that capitalism caused the Great Depression, which was also partly responsible for Germany's decision to take out these loans, but in that case we are merely shifting the blame. Thus we can see that in Burnham's organic prophecy, it fails to actually explain the outcome of society. Burnham at several times refers to Nazi Germany's economy as managerial, but is this even true? He argues that the managerial society is characterized by a nationalization of the economy, as well as state ownership of the means of production. But Hitler actually in the first place privatized many nationalized enterprises, including banks. And second, he presided over an economy filled with large private enterprises, which were operating to some extent under the profit motive, although this was attenuated by the influence that the state had over the economy through corporatism, by which they tended to set production quotas. In a very broad sense, we might be able to call a corporatist economy managerial. However, it does not fit Burnham's definition of managerial since it still respected private property rights. These rights went so far that the state applied the personality principle, or the Führer principle, to businesses. This meant that the owner of a business was in a sense the supreme leader of it. The state did reserve the right to control the means of production. It is true that the Nazi economic plan included a provision to nationalize large companies, but this was never actually implemented. It is also true that state enterprises were responsible for a lot of wartime production, and that a large proportion of the economy was war-related. Burnham mentions this and parallels it to the experience inside the United States, but as we can see, these were temporary measures. Germany's economy was then, to a large extent, private, although it was dominated by state actions where they interfered with the state interest or where the state had a relevant interest. It is therefore not literally managerial. It granted too much autonomy to the owners of enterprises to be truly managerial. If you wanted to apply Burnham's frame, then you might want to say that Germany was a third way between capitalism and managerialism. One could therefore argue that Burnham's grouping of all anti-capitalist economic ideologies into one label, managerial society, is quite reductive and doesn't capture the complexity of the phenomenon. It's fair to say that two of them were dialectically united by a common history, i.e. opposition to capitalism, but then we have to consider the New Deal, which was never meant to be an anti-capitalist policy. Burnham doesn't differentiate between interventionism and central planning. Interventionism presumes that the forces which are being intervened in are market forces, which assumes some degree of market freedom, whereas a planned economy does not allow for autonomous action by market actors at all. Burnham practically rejects the existence of mixed market economies and asserts that interventionism, like the New Deal, leads through to the managerial society. Here, Orwell's criticism becomes quite obviously justified, since Burnham saw the policies of the New Deal and assumed that they would continue indefinitely and grow in intensity over time until it ended in complete saturation of a managerial society. This did not happen. The New Deal was, and has remained, a simple exercise in mixed market economics. That Burnham did not allow for conditions to stabilize and insisted on catastrophizing every political event and policy is one of the greatest intellectual weaknesses in this book. It's rather funny and maybe a little sad that he predicted that Germany, Japan, and the United States would form three superstates, partly because at the time the book was written, 1941, Germany and Japan looked like they were winning the war. He was absolutely convinced that the Axis would win World War II because of his theory that managerial society is superior to capitalist society in economic terms. The failure of this prediction doesn't necessarily render his entire thesis wrong, but it has to be noted when evaluating this book and the methods of its author. Finally, I want to note something really stupid that Burnham said. He stated that there is a common history between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany of anti-capitalism, which is true, but further, on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that there is no other reason for the pact. The obvious rebuttal to this, which you can read on Wikipedia, is that one motive for the pact was that Germany wanted to ensure itself against aggression from the Allies, since the British had threatened to go to war if Poland was invaded. For context, Germany and the Soviets had previously been involved in the Spanish Civil War, which was a proxy war, so it's not as though Hitler and Stalin were very close at all. Hitler's solution to the Polish-English problem was to make a deal with the Soviets to divide up Poland so he wouldn't face attack from the east over it, and then get involved in a two-front war. Alfred Rosenberg wrote, "When Germany's life is at stake, even a temporary alliance with Moscow must be contemplated." This alliance was not made because there was a common history of anti-capitalism per se, but rather it was simply a logical compromise intended to solve a present geopolitical problem. Burnham's managerial thesis does not explain the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. One last thing I want to note is a particularly insightful theory by Burnham, which is that managerial society will not necessarily be totalitarian. Rather, it will trend toward a managed version of democracy, which serves as an information gathering system that enables the managers to make better decisions. He likens it to the worker Soviets in the USSR, which granted at least the illusion of democratic control. This serves foremost as an outlet valve for discontent, which preserves the regime against revolt, since he notes that every prior revolution has involved a triple battle, the elites against revolutionaries, and the revolutionaries against both the elites and the masses. Democracy is part of the system that controls or oppresses the masses. We can see that Burnham's power analysis is actually pretty deep, and it seems to borrow quite a lot from Pareto and the other sources for the Italian elite school. We can see this even in the way Burnham defines sovereignty, which is the exclusive power to make rules. Thus, in liberal democracy, he locates sovereignty not in the people, but rather in the legislature. This subversion of the paradigm of sovereignty is something we might expect from a reactionary rather than a conservative. Overall, the managerial revolution is an interesting thesis, and it cannot but be of interest to those witnessing the unfolding of global power and the increasing authoritarianism of liberal states. But once we have stripped out the central thesis of this book, which is the theory that managerialism emerges organically through social productive factors, its only remaining claim is that a political revolution will happen that accomplishes managerialism. In such a way, it cannot really distinguish itself as a theory from common sense observations made by other power analysts like Bertrand de Jouvenel, such as the fact that power has a tendency to grow and to centralize over time, taking under itself more and more domains of human activity, including the economy. I am at least impressed by the effort made by Burnham here, but I am not convinced that the mechanics of his thesis are true. Though one can still say that there are forces today acting against economic and political autonomy. Of all the traits of this book, I appreciate its refusal to morally evaluate the managerial society. This comes in contrast to Burnham's scathing treatment of what he calls liberalism and suicide of the West. This was an honest attempt to articulate a scientifically verifiable theory of economic evolution. All that remains is for you, the viewer, to evaluate it for yourself.